We were just three friends, out for a summer camping trip. Ryan, Samuel, and me. It was supposed to be simple, relaxing, the kind of trip we'd remember for years. But now, I wish I could forget every second of it. The drive took us deep into the wilderness. The road twisted and turned through thick woods. As the hours passed, the trees seemed to close in on us. After what felt like forever, we stopped by a beaten-down path. That's when we saw them. Two hunters. They stared at us. "Careful out here," one of them spoke, his tone more warning than friendly. The other just smirked. We didn't say anything back, just drove past. But their eyes pointed at us until we disappeared into the trees. When we finally reached the campsite, night was already creeping in. The air was cold, the woods darker than I expected. We set up our tents quickly, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling the hunters had left behind. As the fire crackled and the stars appeared, I thought maybe we could relax. But then, the smell started. It was faint at first, just a hint of something foul, like something had rotted nearby. "Do you smell that?" Samuel asked, wrinkling his nose. We tried to ignore it, but the odor grew stronger, more pungent, until it was impossible to overlook. We followed the smell. The deeper we went into the forest, the more it suffocated us. And then we saw it. A deer, its body torn apart, half of it gone, like something had been feeding on it. But what really made my skin crawl was the sound, a wet, tearing noise. And then we saw it was crouched over the deer. Pale skin stretched tight over its body, ribs visible through thin white flesh. Its eyes, no, there were no eyes, just empty black sockets. And its mouth, stained red, moved in slow, deliberate bites. We stood there, frozen. The creature didn't seem to notice us. I didn't even want to breathe, afraid it would hear. But then, Samuel shifted his foot. The snap of a dry branch echoed through the stillness. The creature stopped, its head jerked up, turning in our direction. We didn't wait. We ran. I could hear it chasing us, crashing through the underbrush. The forest blurred around me, branches whipping my face as we tore through the woods. I could hear Samuel's and Noah shouting, "Go! Go! Go!" But that sound, the thing behind us, never stopped. Somehow we made it to the road. The first building we found was a small police outpost, and we stumbled inside. We tried to explain, but the officers just looked at us like we were crazy. "You boys need to calm down," one of them said. "No creatures out here. You guys must have had a bad dream." We tried to convince them, but it was no use. We left the station, confused, terrified, but alive. 2 days later, we saw the news. The hunters, the ones we passed earlier, their bodies had been found, mutilated, parts missing, no eyes, just like the deer. The police still didn't believe us. But now every time I close my eyes, I see those empty sockets staring back at me, waiting. And every time the wind rustles the trees outside, I wonder, is it still out there, looking for something else to devour? Or maybe it's waiting for us to come back. In the summer of 2012, Logan's parents sent him to a camp, not far from his grandparents' house. It was supposed to be a place for fun, a break from the regular summer boredom. But the moment they pulled up to the camp's entrance, something didn't feel right. The camp was eerily quiet, and the kids standing by the cabin stared in silence as Logan stepped out of the car. His grandparents exchanged uneasy glances, but before they could say anything, one of the camp organizers greeted them. A man with a stiff, unnatural smile plastered across his face. "We'll take good care of him," he said, but something about the way he spoke gave Logan an eerie feeling. His grandparents waved goodbye, though Logan noticed the hesitation in their eyes. As their car disappeared down the road, he was left alone with the other campers and the strange way they all stared at him. The first day passed in a blur of uneasy encounters. The other kids wouldn't talk, only watched him, their gazes unblinking and distant. By nightfall, Logan wanted nothing more than to retreat to his tent. But as darkness fell, things began to get even stranger. It started with whispers, soft voices drifting through the air as Logan lay in his sleeping bag. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, just out of reach. He peeked out of the tent flap, hoping it was just the wind. But then, he saw her. A girl, maybe his age, was kneeling in the dirt, a shovel in her hands. The sound of metal scraping filled the silence as she dug. Logan's heart raced as he watched her, frozen in place. When she noticed him, she didn't smile, didn't flinch. She simply looked up and said, "It's for you." Logan's blood turned to ice. He scrambled out of his tent, rushing toward the main cabin where the camp organizer stayed. There had to be an explanation. This had to be some prank. But as he burst through the door, he froze in shock. "You're not supposed to be here, Logan," organizer said, his voice with anger. "What do you mean?" Logan's whole body trembled. The organizer took a slow step forward. His eyes were creepy and inexplicable. "We're all dead," he whispered. Logan stumbled backward. The kids, the eerie silence, the strange behavior. He turned to run, but everywhere he looked, the children had appeared. Standing motionless around the campfire, their eyes wide, creepy smiles on their faces. "You were never meant to come here," the organizer continued, his voice echoing as the shadows seemed to close in. "This camp, it's not for the living." Logan's could barely process what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure. He had to get out. The ghosts of the children moved closer, their movements slow and unnatural, as if they were being dragged by some unseen force. Logan bolted, running as fast as he could toward the tree line, his only thought to escape the nightmare surrounding him. Just as he reached the edge of the camp, headlights broke through the darkness. His grandfather's truck screeched to a halt, and without thinking, Logan threw himself into the passenger seat. "Go! Please just go!" he screamed, not daring to look back. His grandfather didn't ask questions. He could see the terror in Logan's eyes, speeding away from the camp as fast as possible. It wasn't until they were safely home that Logan's grandfather finally spoke. "I didn't want to say anything earlier," he began, "but the camp bus, it crashed years ago, killing everyone on board. I thought the camp had shut down for good." Logan sat in stunned silence, his mind spinning. The ghosts, the whispers, the girl digging his grave. It all made sense now, in a horrifying way. The camp wasn't for the living, and for the rest of his life, Logan would never forget the way those children had looked at him. Like he was already one of them. He never returned to any camp after that. I'll never forget the night that drove me to leave the forest for good. My name is George, and for years I was a forest officer, patrolling the dense forest, where most people never dared to tread. But one experience changed everything, an encounter that still haunts me. It was late September, when I was tasked with finding a missing camper. A man had been out in the woods for days, and no one knew where he was. My partner, Paul, and I were assigned to the search. It seemed routine at first. People got lost in the forest all the time. We always found them, usually alive. We drove for hours until the trail narrowed and forced us to continue on foot. By the time we reached the man's campsite, the sun had dipped below the tree line, casting everything in that eerie twilight glow. His tent was there, but it was empty. No signs of life, not even a campfire. Something was off. As we searched around, I caught a stench of something foul, not like rotting food, but something worse. Something that made hard to breathe. Paul noticed it too, wrinkling his nose, as we crouched by the tent's entrance. "I don't like this," he muttered. That's when I saw them. Strange tracks in the dirt. They looked almost like animal prints, but were elongated, like something had been dragging itself through the mud. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the shadows. Then I heard the footsteps, crunching through the underbrush. Paul and I froze, our flashlights sweeping the dark forest. And there, between the trees, I saw him, a man in a white shirt and black pants, moving stiffly, almost mechanically, like he wasn't fully in control of his own body. "That must be him," Paul said, though his voice didn't sound sure. I approached the man cautiously, calling out to him, but he didn't respond. He just stared straight ahead. His face was hidden under his hair, movements unnatural. Something was not right. "Let's get him back to the car," I said, more to calm myself than anything else. I grabbed his arm gently, steering him toward the vehicle, trying to ignore the icy dread creeping up my spine. He didn't resist, but he didn't speak either. Not a word, just that dead stare. Once we reached the car, I helped him into the back seat. I was about to radio for assistance when my phone buzzed. It was Paul, who had gone to check another trail. "George," he said, his voice urgent. "I'm with the team. We found the missing guy. He's already at headquarters." I froze. My blood turned cold. "What do you mean?" I asked, glancing at the figure in the back seat. "We've got him," Paul repeated. "He's safe." "Who did you pick up?" I turned slowly, the breath catching in my throat. The man I'd brought back was gone. The car door, which had been locked, was bent, and like something had forced its way out. The air inside reeked of that same foul stench we'd smelled earlier at the campsite. Then I heard it. A growl, coming from the trees behind me. I didn't wait. I grabbed my flashlight and ran, feet stumbling over roots and rocks as I bolted for the safety of the trail. But it was there, following me. I could hear it, the crunch of its footsteps. I turned, and for a brief moment, my light caught it. A monstrous figure, tall and skeletal, its skin stretched tight over bones that seemed to twist and shift beneath the surface. Its eyes were dark, empty pits, and its mouth filled with sharp teeth, dripping with something I didn't want to think about. I screamed, falling backward as it closed the distance, its long clawed hands reaching for me. I thought I was done for, thought that this was the end. But just as its claws grazed my jacket, gunfire rang out. Paul and the rest of the team had arrived, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they fired at the creature. It screeched, a sound so unnatural it made my skin crawl, before it turned and disappeared into the trees, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. I don't remember much after that. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in a small room at headquarters, Paul sitting beside me, looking pale and shaken. "We looked into it," he said quietly, handing me a file filled with newspaper clippings and old reports. "There are stories, legends, about things that take on human form to lure people away. Skinwalkers." I didn't want to believe it, but after what I saw, how could I not? I quit my job not long after. Couldn't stay in those woods, not after knowing what was out there. I don't tell many people this story, but I'm telling you now. I've heard stories, but nothing prepared me for what happened that night in the wilderness. I was alone, deep in the Northern Territory, miles from anyone or anything. That's exactly how I wanted it. Solitude, just me, my rifle, and the stars. But it all went wrong. So wrong. The first thing that woke me was the smell, like rotting meat baking under the sun. My watch read 2:40 a.m. At first, I thought maybe an animal had come too close, scavenging. But as I sat up in my tent, I heard it, just on the edge of the wind. A noise that didn't belong. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, hesitating for a moment, before unzipping the tent. The air was unnervingly quiet, except for the foul stench that seemed to cling to everything around me. The light from my flashlight swept across the trees, but nothing moved. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, just silence. Then I heard it again, a voice calling my name. Gabriel. My blood froze. It sounded like my mother. The soft lilt, the way she used to call me when I was little. But she was hundreds of miles away, safe at home. There was no way she could be here. And yet, the voice was unmistakable. Gabriel, come here. I swallowed hard, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. But curiosity, or maybe something darker, pulled me out of my camp. I stepped into the woods, the light from my flashlight trembling as it cut through the thick trunks. My boots crunched softly on the forest floor as I ventured deeper, following the voice that kept calling my name, each time more insistent. Gabriel, it's me, your mother. A cold sweat broke out on me. The voice was closer now, just ahead, but it wasn't right. Like someone trying to be my mother, but not quite pulling it off. I pressed forward, rifle gripped tightly in my hand, every instinct screaming for me to turn back. But I couldn't. Then the voice stopped, and that's when I saw it. Standing among the trees, half shrouded in shadow, was a figure, tall. I raised my flashlight, the beam catching its outline. A deer's head, antlers curling into the night sky. But below it, a human body. It stood at least 11 feet tall, hunched slightly, its dark, fiery eyes glowing in the dim light, staring straight at me. Gabriel, it crooned, my mother's voice dripping from its throat, but the lips didn't move. The sound just came from it. I felt my legs lock, fear gripping me like a vice. My mind screamed at me to run, but I was frozen, staring at this nightmare standing just a few feet away. It tilted its head, the deer's skull cracking as it moved, like something trapped inside was struggling to fit into that grotesque body. Come closer, Gabriel, it said again. Without thinking, I raised my rifle and fired. The crack of the shot echoed through the trees. But instead of falling, the creature let out a scream that ripped through the air, a high-pitched wail that didn't sound like anything human or animal. It twisted in the darkness, its body contorting, as it vanished into the forest. I stood there for a moment, staring into the blackness where the creature had been. The night seemed to close in on me, the weight of the silence almost unbearable. I turned and sprinted back to my camp. When I arrived, the sight that greeted me was worse than I could have imagined. My tent had been torn to shreds, the canvas flapping loosely in the breeze, as if some massive clawed creature had ripped through it in a frenzy. The smell of rot still lingered in the air, but stronger now. Like whatever that thing was, had been inside my camp while I was gone. Panic surged through me. I grabbed what little I could salvage. I didn't stop until I reached the road, hours later soaked in sweat. I never went back, never returned to that part of the woods again. To this day, I don't know what I saw. A hallucination, maybe? A nightmare that felt all too real? The fire crackled and hissed as the four of us, Harry, Jack, Daniel, and Lucas, sat in the shadow of Buckingham Palace, the cold January air biting at our faces. It was supposed to be a simple tour, but as the night deepened, the conversation shifted. We found ourselves discussing eerie places and, of course, ghost stories. Harry leaned forward, the flickering flames casting long shadows across his face. "I've got a real one for you," he said. "It's about Jack." Jack shifted uncomfortably but didn't stop him. The rest of us exchanged glances, curiosity gnawing at us. "It happened not long ago," Harry began. Jack was driving down a deserted highway late one night, far outside the city. The road stretched out endlessly. No other cars, just the sound of the wind whistling through the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves along the side of the road. Jack's gaze remained fixed on the fire, his jaw clenched as Harry continued. He was tired but determined to get home. Then out of nowhere, an old man appeared in the middle of the road. Jack brakes. The man didn't flinch. He just stood there, staring at Jack with his eyes. His clothes were ancient, like something out of a different era. Jack rolled down his window, unsure what to do. But before he could speak, the old man approached and, in the strangest voice, said, "You need to come with me. It's not safe here." We all tensed. Something about the way Harry was telling it made Daniel glanced nervously around, as if expecting to see the old man emerging from the shadows at any moment. Jack was hesitant, but the old man seemed desperate. He kept repeating that something was out there, something that wanted revenge. Jack finally spoke. He said he lost his son in a car crash on that same road, and that his son's spirit was still out there, angry. The old man led Jack to a hut, Harry said, taking over again. A small, run-down thing just off the road, hidden by trees. That's when the old man told him the full story. Harry paused for effect, and the silence around us was deafening. The old man and his son had died in a car accident years ago, a terrible, tragic thing. But while the old man had accepted his fate, his son hadn't. His spirit was angry, vengeful. He'd been trapped on that stretch of road ever since, luring people like Jack to the same fate. Lucas shifted uneasily. And Jack? What happened? Harry's face darkened. Jack wasn't meant to leave. The son's spirit wanted to claim him, to drag him down into the same misery he was trapped in. Jack tried to get out, but the door wouldn't open. He was trapped. That's when I showed up, Harry said. I'd been worried about Jack. He hadn't answered his phone, hadn't checked in. So I went looking for him. I found him just in time, standing frozen in front of that old hut. I knew something was wrong. He paused, the fire flickering in the reflection of his eyes. I couldn't see the spirit, but I felt it. I grabbed Jack, pulled him away, and that's when the old man spoke again. "Leave him to me," he said. "He's mine to deal with." And just like that, the spirit vanished. The old man looked at me one last time. The crackling of the fire was the only sound for a moment. We sat in silence, trying to process the story, our minds buzzing with questions, with disbelief. "That's not the end," Harry whispered. Before any of us could ask what he meant, we heard it. Footsteps, the sound of shoes crunching on the gravel path behind us. Lucas's face went pale. "No way!" The footsteps grew closer, steady, deliberate. We turned slowly. A figure emerged from the shadows, shrouded in darkness. It was the old man, the same ragged clothes, the eyes, the worn face. He didn't say a word, just stood there watching us. And then, without warning, he took a step forward. Then another, closer. That was all it took. In a frenzy, we bolted, stumbling, tripping over each other as we scrambled into the night, our hearts racing, adrenaline surging through our veins. We didn't look back. We couldn't. That thing wasn't human, wasn't real, but it had followed us. To this day, we don't talk about that night. Whatever we saw, whatever Harry had told us, it wasn't just a story.